Hello wrestling fans. Welcome back to the $29 million Pro Wrestle Machine studio and welcome back to the show. Through the use of the Pro Wrestle Machine. January 19, 1998 Wrestling Observer Newsletter. 18th Annual Newsletter Awards Issue. By Observer Staff. Most of the major news over the past week revolved around speculation involving Mike Tyson and Hulk Hogan. Both stories are different, but in a sense become somewhat entwined, creating speculation of a Tyson vs. Hogan match at WrestleMania. Where the truth ends and fantasy begins in these speculations is unclear. What is clear is that Tyson will become a regular character in the WWF starting with the Royal Rumble on January 18 through WrestleMania on March 29, at which point he'll slide back into the boxing world. He is booked to appear both at the Rumble and on Raw on January 19 from Fresno, California. The plan is for Tyson to appear on most, but not all the Raw television shows, creating a storyline climaxing at WrestleMania. It is unclear whether Don King will be in San Jose or Fresno. There were no plans at press time for that to happen, but King will also be appearing at least a few times on WWF television as well as WrestleMania. The role for has been speculated largely as being either a referee or an enforcer, a la Chuck Norris' role at the 1994 Survivor Series, backing a heel who tries to interfere in a key match, likely the main event. The WWF has denied the enforcer speculation. All that we do know is that his position at WrestleMania won't be made clear until mid to late February, and a week-by-week storyline has been formulated. He isn't expected to be a participant in a match, although we aren't certain of that, but he is expected to be the prime focal point and marketing force behind the Mania pay-per-view show. Whatever the true money figure is for this angle, believed to be $4 million or more, on paper, it will take a very creative storyline to make him worth that kind of money when it comes to buys. The recent Starrcade, which was the biggest pay-per-view money-wise of the past 6 years, only grossed about $6.5 million total, in a role other than a participant in a match. However, strong media hype linked to his appearance will re-establish the WrestleMania name as the crown jewel in the wrestling calendar, as the event clearly lost its luster over the past 2 years to the mainstream without the celebrity involvement that put the name over in the first place. It will also re-establish the WWF as the brand name for pro wrestling after a year where WCW got most of the mainstream headlines. One would think the Raw ratings should get a significant boost on January 19 with the promised Tyson appearance, particularly since one would expect something noteworthy involving him at the Rumble. Whether frequent Tyson appearances will continue to build the Monday ratings because of storyline advances, or burn him out before the big payoff if he can't pull his role off well, is the big question. It is evident from television that Tyson will play a strong babyface role, which may be part of a joint Don King/WWF plan to have the WWF television, which if nothing else is expert at manipulating its public, to soften his negative image before July, so if when he gets reinstated into boxing at that time. And for financial reasons, insiders consider that almost a given, that the public outcry won't be that strong since the media outcry almost surely will be. I'm almost expecting a WrestleMania climax of Austin hitting the stunner on Michaels, who according to office sources is already bellyaching about that, while Tyson, whatever his role is supposed to be, KOs Helmsley. Everyone leaves happy. Good triumphs over scumbags. Tyson is the main man on the side of good. Tons of media attention, all showing the lasting image of a sellout crowd in Boston giving him a thunderous approving pop. Next he can get reinstated, and then it's up to the boxing people to figure out how to get Holyfield to lose to him so everyone living off boxing pay-per-view income can make money happily ever after. The WWF checked back in November with the Nevada State Athletic Commission about this deal, knowing full well that if the commission had a problem with Tyson doing wrestling gigs when it came to considering his reinstatement, that they had zero chance of getting him to do the show. The commission gave them the green light, so a lot of the talk by various commissioners saying that Tyson is violating the spirit, if not the letter of the suspension, by making millions doing pro wrestling when he is supposed to be laying low and accepting his punishment, is just public posturing. The head of the Massachusetts Commission said they would send a letter recommending Tyson not be used on the show, but since that commission has no governing power over pro wrestling when it comes to regulating or licensing, that is also just posturing. The expected negative media articles have followed. They've got 4 easy targets: Tyson, Don King, Vince McMahon, and pro wrestling. The WWF expected it, and maybe, based on its new image, wants it. And, quite frankly, deserves most of it. Mark Kriegel in the January 9 New York Daily News compared Tyson in pro wrestling to the last act of the 1956 boxing movie classic Requiem for a Heavyweight. Unlike many reporters, Kriegel actually viewed 1 or more episodes of Raw, seeing Goldust as a transvestite, in a diaper, and appearing in blackface as a stereotypical pimp, the Puerto Rican biker and black gangs, and called McMahon the high priest of low life, and called Sable the house slut. This was followed by New York Post columnist and TV sports reporter Wallace Matthews doing a similarly negative column, although much of his ire was placed at Tyson, who he called a hypocritical, whining, self-pitying little puke. The wrestling comments were limited to calling the WWF an outlaw organization, negative redeeming values that is rife with drug abuse, fosters the worst racial stereotypes, and glorifies gang violence. Matthews said McMahon justifies it by saying it's adult-oriented entertainment, but Matthews asked then why are his arenas filled with 14-year-olds? His final jab at Tyson was to point out that when Tyson got out of his 3-year prison stay he was only 182 pounds, but by the time he returned to his first match against Peter McNeely he was magically pumped up to 220. And they say Tyson is lowering himself to join the WWF? You can't expect morals in the pro wrestling business, nor the pro boxing business. But please don't use that as a defense for the lack of morals of either industry, just a realistic appraisal of both. Which leads us to a more tricky situation, the contractual situation regarding Hulk Hogan. The general belief within WCW is that Hogan inked a new deal with WCW on January 12, which is why his attorney Henry Holmes, who was in town to finalize the deal, appeared on Nitro. Supposedly coming off the wildly successful Starrcade, Hogan was able to negotiate himself a huge raise, some saying $1.5 million per year, with the same money figure being thrown around as the appearance bond being an inside rib regarding the raise, just as Eric Bischoff throwing around the $7.5 million figure in the Bret Hart skits may have been an approximation of the total worth over 3 years of the real deal. Perhaps the figure is true. We do know that the original storyline was going to be a $1 million performance bond and it was changed. Speculation went crazy, most in the industry believing it was all fueled by Hogan to use it to sweeten his deal, that Hogan would be headed to the WWF. WCW had all along claimed Hogan was with them, and with the exception of Thursday afternoon when the rumors got very strong, it didn't appear that it was a story many people on the inside were taking seriously, although it did become topic number one on the outside. WWF officials who theoretically would have had to know were largely consistent in claiming there had been no negotiations whatsoever with Hogan, claiming they were under the impression he was under contract all along and the last thing they would do is ruin their lawsuit against WCW by tampering with contracted personnel. One other who wouldn't have to know did indicate there was at least smoke to the fire, which only fueled speculation in many places that everyone involved on all sides was lying to keep a secret that by this point everyone had heard. All that we do know is it appears WCW's claims of having Hogan completely locked up at the time they were made don't appear to have been true. If they were, there wouldn't have been so much negotiating going on over the past week and the timing of the new deal wouldn't be so coincidental with these stories. Sources close to Hogan claimed that on January 7th, Hogan was to meet with Dr. Harvey Schiller about a new deal as that the negotiations had gone over Eric Bischoff's head. Supposedly the speculation about USA Network picking up the television show being a tie-in for a move to WWF were denied as Hogan claimed one had nothing to do with the other. The fact is at press time, there had yet to be even a meeting between Hogan and USA Network about the Shadow Warriors television show. While one could believe the possibility of secret third-party negotiations involving the WWF and pro wrestling when it comes to Hogan, when it comes to picking up a new television series on the USA Network, the negotiations wouldn't be done in such a clandestine manner. It is logical that in a heated ratings battle with TNT, that USA would be interested in stealing what they perceive to be a top ratings attraction at its rival network. However, there is no evidence that anything that happened other than Hogan had shopped the idea of the show to USA and many other cable networks after TNT basically turned the show down. It is logical that if he was offered the opportunity to do a single match with Tyson that Hogan would be interested. Logically, the WWF would certainly be interested in Hogan in such a competitive wrestling war should he be available to them. I've got no evidence that logic materialized into any negotiations that would be considered serious on either side. One source very closely tied into Hogan denied it, although apparently some others somewhere must be saying otherwise. One would think Hogan would play both sides when trying to ink a new deal and get a raise. Hogan was said while this was all going on to have claimed the TV deal as the TV deal, and the wrestling deal would be to whichever side offered the most money, which he strongly presumed would be WCW. Rumors got so out of hand and that it was actually reported in mainstream newspapers that the WWF hotline had claimed Hogan had signed a 2-year deal with their organization. Not true, and after that came out, Jim Ross on the WWF hotline strongly denied any negotiations had even taken place and went so far as to claim the entire story was all manipulation by Hogan to create a story and end up getting a raise out of it, And there was speculation about which TV taping on January 12 that Hogan would appear on, although the truth was that nobody in WWF expected him at the taping and nobody at WCW didn't expect that he wouldn't be at their taping. On the January 8 Thunder Show, in addressing the rumors actually on the air, Hogan claimed he was where he was for life, but of course given Hogan's track record for honesty that also only fueled rumors more. Bobo Brazil, who was one of the biggest international superstars in pro wrestling in the 50s, 60s and 70s, is currently in critical condition after suffering a serious stroke about 3 weeks ago. Brazil, real name Houston Harris, is at the Lakeland Medical Center in St. Joseph, Michigan in room 2221 in the critical care unit. According to family members, he is having his good days and his bad days, and the family said that he welcomes any and all get well cards from wrestling fans. Brazil, who is believed to be 73, was originally from Benton Harbor, Michigan, but was a globe-trotting star, main eventer, top draw and easy pick as a Hall of Fame caliber superstar. He was virtually always a babyface, known in particular for his Coco Butt, headbutt, finisher, which in that era of wrestling was a stereotypical move of most if not every black wrestlers. He was not what would be considered by today's standards as a good worker, but was very well regarded and respected within the business for being a large, tough man who got over and could draw in every market he appeared. He rarely did jobs, although that was never attributed to him having an ego, as the promoters of that era didn't want to raise the ire of the fans who came predominantly to see him by having him lose unless it was necessary. He worked in virtually every major territory at one time or another and almost always as a headliner. But he was most well known in his native Michigan as the top babyface in the area for more than a decade, feuding with all the top heels in the promotion on and off for about 15 years, 1961 through 1976, frequently selling out the weekly shows at Detroit's Cobo Hall, as today's Cobo Arena was then known as. The first top heel he headlined against on a regular basis would have been Dick the Bruiser in the early 60s as Detroit's biggest gate attraction. Later, his most famous feud of all, which went around the world, was with the Sheik from the mid-60s through mid-70s, although the two actually still worked in Michigan indie shows against each other through the late 80s. In the early and mid-70s, when he was the perennial United States champion, he headlined Detroit against the likes of Pampero Firpo and Abdullah the Butcher among many others, and actually defended the Detroit singles title around the globe. He held Detroit version of the United States title on 9 occasions, and also held the San Francisco version once in 1965 and the Toronto version once, including the most famous match of that era in Detroit on May 29, 1971, when he pinned the Sheik after a Coco Butt to win the U.S. title, ending Sheik's 6-year-plus reign as the unbeatable heel champion headliner in that city. He's also a notable figure in Japanese wrestling history as from 1965, when Giant Baba was promoted to being the top star with the Japanese Wrestling Association, a monopoly group in that company for most of the 60s. Through 1970, Baba beat virtually every big-name foreign star of that era and only lost one match by pin in Japan on June 25, 1968 in Nagoya to Brazil, with Brazil capturing the international heavyweight title. Although he dropped the title back only 2 days later to Baba in Tokyo, this win made Brazil a huge star in Japan every time he returned, and after Baba left the JWA to form All Japan, the JWA brought Brazil back to Japan in late 1972 to get the international belt a second time. Although his main role was to do a job and thus give credibility to the belt after Baba left to the new champion in building up Korean star Kentaro Oki as the promotion's new top star, which didn't work as the JWA without Baba or Antonio Inoki on top folded less than 5 months later. To show how different the world really is, when Brazil first became a star, he was billed as the Negro World Heavyweight Champion. Because there were so few black wrestlers in the business at the time he was breaking into the top, his skin color actually was his gimmick. Funny how different the world really isn't. Many years later, when he defeated Buddy Austin on September 2, 1966 at the Olympic Auditorium in Los Angeles to win the WWA World Heavyweight title, he was billed as the first black man to hold the world title, which probably wasn't the case and was later forgotten as the carrot was dangled of being the first for every black contender for the NWA title over the next 26 years. After his second title win, also over Austin on January 12, 1968, the LaBelle promotion joined the NWA and the WWA title was vacated in favor of creating the Americas title as the regional title for that office. This set up another of the most famous matches from that era, a champion versus uncrowned champion match on December 18, 1968 in Los Angeles, where NWA champion Gene Kiniski and Brazil went to a 60-minute draw. Around the world he feuded often with other black wrestlers who turned on him, particularly in the early 70s when black heels would play a militant type of role and refer to him as an Uncle Tom, most notably the likes of Ernie Ladd and Bearcat Wright, and would often form a tag team with smaller black wrestlers after saving them from double teaming in almost the Big Brother role. Brazil, who was 6'4" and 280 pounds during a time period when most wrestlers were quite a bit smaller, was considered as almost a giant in those days. He remained a headliner throughout the 70s and continued to wrestle on occasion until 1990. There is more jockeying for position on television, with WCW moving to 3 hours on Monday, debuting Thunder on Thursday, and above all, ratings have improved from already strong numbers every Mondays with football season having ended. The Thunder debut drew a 4.02 rating, 3.75 first hour, 4.25 seconds hour, 4.03 third hour, and 5.99 share, going head-to-head with NBC's strong Thursday night lineup, including Friends, Seinfeld, and ER. Even though the show was almost totally forgettable except for another great in-ring interview confrontation between Ric Flair and Bret Hart, the audience is into the hype and pageantry of WCW wrestling. The show actually peaked for a replay of the Eric Bischoff vs. Larry Zbyszko Starrcade match, and remained strong until basically dying for the Poor Diamond Dallas Page vs. Kevin Nash main event, falling from a 4.3 to a 3.4 during that match, and that's with weaker local news competition than ER and with no opposing wrestling show to turn to. The show was supposed to go 3 hours and be immediately followed by a replay, which did a 1.3 rating, and actually went about 15 minutes long due to the Flair-Hart deal for the second straight time going far longer than they were supposed to. It was said to have been the highest-rated debut for a weekly series in the history of cable, which is somewhat misleading since NFL games always draw better and pro wrestling shows in the 80s debuted with numbers in that range and sometimes higher, although with cable in its infancy the total audience was far lower. Literally almost nobody knew until a few days ahead whether the debut show would be 2 or 3 hours. The plan for a regular basis is the show will be from 8:05 to 10:05 p.m., followed by a movie from 10:05 to 12:35 a.m. and the replay from 12:35 a.m. to 2:35 a.m. effective January 26th. Nitro will become a 3-hour show every week. The decision was made largely because WWF Raw ratings were showing significant growth as soon as Nitro went off the air over the past several weeks. It used to be that no significant percentage of Nitro viewers would switch to Raw when Nitro would go off the air, but that is no longer the case. With Mike Tyson becoming a regular on Raw and no doubt his appearances being held until the last quarter hour of the show, Raw, at least at first, would be expected to do some strong numbers if left unopposed. Of course, doing 5 live hours every week could and probably at some point will lead to overexposure, whether it be in a few months or a few years. Overexposure is a cumulative thing, not something immediate, and right now wrestling is hot. This is no different than a dozen other times in the history of wrestling, and it's no more over now than at any of those times. It's a cyclical business, and this is an up cycle. Overexposure killed many of the biggest up cycles of the past, and the problem is when we see the slide beginning, by the time we recognize it, it'll already be too late because the snowball going downward doesn't reverse. For January 5th, Nitro did a 4.3 rating, 4.6 first hour, 4.1 seconds hour, and 6.4 share. Raw did a 3.3 rating, 3.0 first hour, 3.7 seconds hour, and 5.0 share. The Nitro replay did a 2.1 rating, 2.1 first hour, 2.1 seconds hour, and 4.0 share. For January 12th, Nitro did a 4.52 rating, 4.78 first hour, 4.32 seconds hour, and 6.83 share. Raw did a 3.46 rating, 3.23 first hour, 3.70 seconds hour, and 5.40 share. Nitro replay did a 2.19 rating, 2.25 first hour, 2.14 seconds hour, and 4.32 share. Nitro peaked at a 5.2 for the Saturn vs. T match and the conference with Nick Lambros, Giant, Hogan, Nash, Henry Holmes, Bischoff. In the head-to-head 77 minutes, WWF did strongly for the Shamrock and Henry vs. Nation of Domination match, doing a 3.5 to WCW's 4.4 for the Bischoff and Hogan interview and Flair-Neidhart confrontation. WCW remained at 4.4 for the Hall and Nash tag title win over Steiners, which included Hogan and Savage at ringside, while WWF did a 3.2 for a DX promo and Hart on the screen, on the return of the Rock and Roll Express. After Nitro went off the air, WWF picked up to a 3.5, Cactus Jack interview, Mankind vs. Goldust, 4.0, McMahon-Tyson announcement and Bariqua's tag match, and 4.1, DX interview and confrontation with Undertaker, followed by Royal Rumble brawl with the latest weekly undelivered promise of the drawing. Most of the wrestling on the first Thunder show ranged from poor to average, with Juventud Guerrera as expected capturing the Cruiserweight title from Ultimo Dragon in 420 of a good but not great match. The second Flair-Hart confrontation was every bit as strong as the first 3 days earlier, although this is the type of angle that would work better if they held the first pay-per-view match off 2 or 3 months and let it simmer with a slow build, but since they have no strong main event for the January 24th show, it's being rushed. As expected, after showing footage of the Hogan vs. Sting matches from Starrcade in Baltimore, they announced the title was held up but didn't announce how the vacancy would be filled. Nothing is actually official. What we believe is going to happen is that they are going to hold a tournament with all the top draws, Flair, Piper, Hall, Nash, Savage, Hart, etc., with matches every Monday and Wednesday and the winner becoming the top contender, while the title itself will be decided in a Hogan vs. Sting match on February 22nd at the San Francisco Cow Palace at Super Brawl. It also may wind up with Hogan and Sting thrown into the tournament and the finals of the tourney at Super Brawl. Probably all depends on which idea Hogan approves. It was another bad sign for Hogan-Sting as a worked match, but not as a match to sell tickets, as the January 31st Boston house show is expected to sell out, when after the confrontation and angles in Daytona Beach. When the two then came out after the show for a dark match, there was shockingly little heat after the ring entrances, and not even a big pop when Sting beat Hogan, who tapped out this time for everyone to see, with the Scorpion in 501. Hogan did nix the idea of working dark matches at all the Thursday shows against Page, and had this match switched to Sting. It was really weird to hear all the talk about a fast count, and then they played the original Starrcade footage without the fast count. To make things even weirder, in Baltimore, when Nick Patrick was again supposed to give the fast count, and this is after all the pressure of having screwed it up the previous night, even the Baltimore count wasn't fast, as was evident to everyone watching on television. Hogan-Sting has a lot of life at the box office, although they may never have a good match, but Sting is more like Piper in that they both have great drawing power opposite Hogan, but against anyone else, they're going to add much in the way of buys to the already existing package. Sting vs. Hall wasn't going to do anything more than an average buy rate, and WCW would be stupid not to rematch Sting and Hogan on pay-per-view after the buy rate that Starrcade did. Japanese television rundown. December 21st, All Japan. 1. Williams and Albright and Barry Windham beat Stan Hansen and Bobby Duncombe Jr. and Takao Mori in 9:31 when Williams pinned Duncombe after a backdrop driver. Only the finish aired. There was some heat at the very end, but it seemed kind of dead overall. 2. Williams and Albright beat Blackjacks when Williams pinned Windham after a Dr. Bomb. Slow plodding match. None of the four looked good, but the finish had some nice near falls. 1/2 of 1 star. 3. Kawada and Taue beat Jinsei Shinzaki and Hayabusa in 1809 when Kawada pinned Shinzaki after a powerbomb. Excellent match, particularly the way Kawada and Taue carried things by making Hayabusa and Shinzaki's high spots all mean something to building the match. They mainly beat on Hayabusa to set up Shinzaki for a hot tag. Big pop when Shinzaki delivered a headbutt off the top on Kawada for a near fall. Hayabusa came in and did all kinds of hot moves on Taue, and the crowd was popping big, climaxing when Hayabusa hit the Firebird. 450. Flash, but Kawada made the save. Although Shinzaki isn't in the league of the other three as a complete worker, he did his spin-around backward dropkick. Kawada hit 3 Enzoi Gyrus on Shinzaki, although the first one missed, and a shotgun-style lariat with a big pop when Shinzaki kicked out. Finally, Kawada delivered the powerbomb and the got 3. 4 1/4 stars. January 4th, All Japan. 1. Kawada and Inoue beat Kobashi and Kanemaru in 1601 when Inoue made Kanemaru submit to the torture rack, which is called the Argentinian backbreaker in Japan. The match had no heat early but built into a good match with very good heat. Inoue was bleeding badly from the mouth, although it wasn't obvious what opened him up. Kanemaru is so small for a wrestler of this style, but he's a good athlete and already a good worker. About 9 minutes aired on television. 3 stars. 2. Izumida won the annual New Year Battle Royal in 1320. Izumida was left with Akiyama and Smith. Akiyama pinned Smith with Izumida's help, then Izumida turned over the pile and Akiyama was pinned. This was awful, even by All Japan Battle Royal standards. Most of the match consisted of everyone standing around and doing nothing. Almost nothing of note. Baba was a focal point of the match and really looked awful, especially when Williams and Ace were selling his chops. Von Crush debuted using the Stone Cold Stunner as his big move, and actually did the move on Misawa, which led to a pileup where Misawa got pinned. -1/2 star. Mexico. Very little news this week. Promo Azteca ran January 9th in Nezahualcóyotl with Vampiro Canadiense beating Pirata Morgan in the main event plus a 4-team tournament for the Azteca Cup won by Team Niebles Jr. and Mascara Sagrada over Salcero and Pantera, Pantera del Ring and Mosco and Super Astro and Zorro. The crowd wasn't packed, which was blamed on the December show in the building where they advertised the double hair versus double mask match, and Ultimo Guerrero no-showed the match since he was going to lose his mask. They also had a match I was told was 3 3/4 stars with Super Crazy and Colton Yurosiko beating Shiryu and Mr. Aguila and Venom Black. For quality of wrestling, the Azteca TV over the past few weeks has been as consistently good as any TV. January 16th show is headlined by Vampiro and Sagrada and Tarzan Boy and Zorro vs. Morgan and Crazy and Pantera del Ring and Ultimo Rebelde. All Japan. Main thing on this tour is the Asunaro Cup tournament. As of January 13th, Akira Taue and Kentaro Shiga had 8 points for the lead while Toshiaki Kawada and Masao Inoue had 6. Mitsuharu Misawa and Satoru Asako, Manukia Mossman and Johnny Smith and Jun Akiyama and Takao Omori had 4 and Kenta Kobashi and Yoshinobu Kanemaru and Tamon Honda and Jun Izumida had 2. Akiyama and Omori lost the All-Asian Tag Team titles by Wolf Hockfield and Johnny Smith on January 9th in Kagoshima when Smith pinned Omori with a reverse DDT in 24:33. Akiyama and Omori had held the belts for 3 years. Akiyama basically said that he's outgrown Omori as a partner since he's a regular challenger for the World Triple Crown and World Tag Team titles, and the Asian belts are a mid-card belt. He said he wanted to finish his partnership with Omori on a high note by winning the Asunaro Cup and said he hopes Omori can find a younger partner to challenge for the Asian belts in the future. Really, most of the internal talk involves the May 1st Tokyo Dome show. Tickets will go on sale on January 31st. Ticket prices will range from 30,000 yen ringside, $250, to 3,000 yen, $25, for the second deck, which is a lower pricing scale than New Japan used on January 4th. Although there is all kinds of speculation everywhere about who is coming from WWF, etc., legitimately Baba's first meeting with Bruce Pritchard and Gerald Briscoe to discuss the card, finishes and the financial guarantees won't be until January 22nd. Unless things fall apart, everyone expects both companies to work together, but no agreement has really even been started, let alone finalized. Kobashi did an interview challenging Vader at the Dome. My feeling is that All Japan would want Shawn Michaels, Undertaker, Steve Austin and Ken Shamrock, and would probably want to negotiate for one major surprise match to make the show memorable and historical. December 14th TV did a 2.7 rating and December 21st did a 3.9. New Japan. At the January 4th Tokyo Dome show, Masahiro Chono came out with Daisuke Miura and Yoshinori Suzuki of the Yokohama Bay Stars baseball team, both of whom were wearing NWO t-shirts. Miura, 24, pitcher, and Suzuki, 25, an outfielder, are the two most popular players on the team, and it got a huge crowd pop with chants for both of them when they came out. There have been hints dropped that Genichiro Tenryu may face Naoya Ogawa on the April 4th Tokyo Dome show. Tokyo Sports reported that Muhammad Ali would be a special guest at the show since it's Antonio Inoki's retirement match. That could be an Inoki work since a few years back when they did the World Wrestling Peace Festival in Los Angeles. They promised all along the involvement of Ali, who never appeared. Inoki himself held a press conference talking about his retirement match and also the forming of his new World Martial Arts Association with Ogawa and Satoru Sayama, and said they'd be opening up an office in Tokyo. Basically, Inoki is going to wind up in the heel manager role against New Japan or build as an executive producer, but really be a heel manager kind of as a spoof on Eric Bischoff. Inoki's final match in Japan would be on the next Dome show, although what percentage of wrestlers actually live up to their word when it comes to retirement matches? But that afterwards he'd continue to fight as a martial artist in foreign countries but not in Japan. There was no hint made about Inoki's final opponent, although he again brought up the name Hulk Hogan, but to say as if it would be impossible. Fan balloting now has Tatsumi Fujinami as the leader, followed by Hickson Gracie, Giant Baba, and Shinjiro Otani. The only foreigners on the January 26th to February 15th tour besides Curt Hennig and Don Frye on the final night are Scott Norton, NWO Sting, and High Voltage. They announced a few more undercard matches for the big shows. On February 7th in Sapporo, added was a 2 out of 3 fall with Tadao Yasuda and Junji Hirata and Kazuo Yamazaki and Shinya Hashimoto versus Hiro Saito and Hiroyoshi Tenzan and NWO Sting and Norton, and on February 8th will be Hayato Nanjo versus Tatsuhito Takaiwa, Otani vs Kendo Kashin, Jushin Liger vs Koji Kanemoto, and Fujinami vs Shiro Koshinaka. Riki Choshu held his retirement party on January 7 in Tokyo, with about 500 guests. Aside from the New Japan wrestlers, appearing at the party included Inoki, Great Sasuke, Nobuhiko Takada, Yuhi Sano, Ryuma Go, Gran Hamada, and Animal Hamaguchi. The NWO members in New Japan didn't appear. There was no major news from the party other than Takashi Iizuka is undergoing knee surgery and will be out for a few months. December 13 TV did a 3.5 rating and December 20 did a 2.6. Other Japan notes. Atsushi Onita Zen Group, the NWO knockoff of FMW, debuted on January 7 at Tokyo Korakuen Hell before a sellout 2,150 fans, with Onita and Koji Nakagawa and Tetsuhiro Kuroda earning the next shot at the World Six-Man Street Fight Tag titles, held by Hayabusa and Masato Tanaka and Jinsei Shinzaki, beating Mr. Ganasuke and Yukihiro Kanemura and Haido. Speaking of Haido, it was announced this week that Haido has become engaged to former FMW star and current television wrestling announcer and pin-up girl Megumi Kudo. Both are 29. No date was announced for the wedding, but it's expected to be in the next month or two. The original idea was for Big Japan to start a feud with Zen at the show, but Big Japan president Shinya Kojika canceled the deal and instead went to the Riki Choshu retirement party that was going on in another part of Tokyo at the same time. At the party, Kojika was saying that they weren't doing business with Zen at this time. FMW nearly dropped its women's wrestling division altogether as there were no women's matches on the first two shows of the tour. Shark Tsuchiya apparently is going to retire and Crusher Matamari has disappeared. The initial reports were that Miss Mongol was going to Asia Kong's New Urgent promotion, while Kaori Nakayama wanted to continue working but had no opponent. Over the past few days, Mongol vs. Nakayama has appeared at the spot shows, but they are the only two women wrestlers left in the promotion. Kyoko Inoue's Neo Ladies promotion debuted on January 9 at Korakuen Hall before a packed house of 2,200 fans. Kyoko herself worked 3 times on the show, beating Misai Genki in a singles, teaming with Tiny Mouse to lose to Itsuko Mita and Mima Shimoda, and doing an angle to set up a 6-women's match where she teamed with Yoshiko Tamura and Shaparita Asari to lose to Mita Shimoda and Saya Endo. The report I got is that the fans really liked the show, but they did nothing memorable or different, and it was just like watching an AJW show with a really hard work rate in the top matches. They announced a second show on February 15 at Tokyo Komazawa Olympic Park Gym with JWP's champion Hikari Fukuoka vs. Inoue as the main event. Pancrase held a press conference on January 9 to announce the signing of Kengo Watabe, 21, who is currently attending Daido College in Japan in his senior year and is a preseason pick for the 1998 All-Japan College rugby team. As the story goes, most of the pro rugby teams were interested in him, but he decided he wanted to learn Pancrase and sign as a green boy going to the school like anyone else rather than having been offered a guaranteed contract to go into pro wrestling. There were 2 women's shows on January 11 at Korakuen Hall, which both drew about 1,600 fans. The afternoon show was JWP, headlined by Neo Ladies vs. JWP as Inoue and Tamura and Mouse beat Fukuoka and Tomoko Kuzumi and Tomoko Miyaguchi in the main event. After the match, Eagle Sawai and Michiko Nagashima and Sori Okino of LLPW jumped the JWP team with chains. Masatoshi Yamamoto, the JWP president, started yelling at Rumi Kazama, the LLPW president, about what was going on, doing a work shoot angle as in they had worked a promotion versus promotion feud and agreed that all business would end on December 6 and now LLPW was double-crossing them on the deal. Kazama told him she was sorry and didn't understand why they did it, and they did it on their own. JWP announced big shows on January 23 in Kawasaki with Dynamite Kansai and Cutie Suzuki vs. Yumiko Hata and Kumiko Maikawa of AJW. And Devil Masami and Fukuoka defend the JWP tag titles against AJW's Manami Toyota and Kaoru Ito. The January 11 evening show was the Nobuko Bison Kimura retirement show put on by JD. In the main event, Lioness Asuka beat Jaguar Yokota to win the TWF title in the first singles rematch between the two since their legendary 1985 match, which drew 13,000 fans in Tokyo. Match ended with a choke sleeper and ref stopping the match at 17:11. At one point, Asuka hung Yokota off the balcony at Korakuen Hall. Asuka after the match said she'd like to form a trio with Mita and Shimoda, who are the Hot Hill tag team in women's wrestling right now. Among those at the show honoring Kimura were Asia Kong, Megumi Kudo, Kaoru, and Combat Toyota, who all started out together in the AJW training camp in 1986. Kimura, 30, debuted in 1986 with AJW and was a headliner from 1990 to 1992 as part of the Jungle Jacks tag team with Kong before retiring. She returned 3 years later on the Tokyo Dome show and in December 1995 went with the new JD group originally to be the top star. She had planned on retiring in September, but when she broke her arm on June 22, that was the end of her career and they held off the official ceremony. She made it clear that she was never returning at the ceremony. Great Sasuke was one of the torch runners for the upcoming Nagano Winter Olympics. Here and there. The item a few issues back in the reader's pages regarding the potential spreading of HIV in a bloody wrestling match was from a recent medical journal article. The actual situation is that there was a fight where a man who was HIV positive headbutted the other, who was wearing glasses, which ended up cutting both men's forehead and there was a lot of blood. The man who was headbutted began developing symptoms consistent with HIV about 2 weeks later and also about 3 months later developed hepatitis B. The return of the Fabulous Ones to Nashville won't be a part of the February 7th Fabulous February reunion for Music City Wrestling. Stan Lane was never officially announced as appearing on the show, although Steve Kieran and Jim Cornette were. However, the company has since announced Kieran and Cornette won't be on the show due to conflicts with Cornette's WWF schedule, but both would be brought in at a later date. The top 3 matches on the show will be Ricky Morton and Robert Gibson returning against Stephen Dunn and Reno Riggins, who are forming a tag team in the area called the Tennessee Volunteers, Colorado Kid and Headbangers versus Billy Travis and Terry Golden and Flash Flanagan and Wolfie D defending the North American title, which he won on January 10th in Nashville, beating Golden in what we're told was a great match against Buddy Landel. Sid Audi is going to start taking independent bookings in February. Brad Kohler, who lost to Trey Telemann at the UFC in Japan on December 21 and has a 7-1 NHB record and placed 5th at the 1996 Olympic trials in Greco-Roman, has started training for pro wrestling under Eddie Sharkey in Minneapolis and reports are that he's showing a lot of promise. Greg Valentine vs. Jim Brunzell headlines a show on February 15 in Rockford, Illinois at the Floatin' East Side Boys Club. American League umpire Larry Young, a major longtime wrestling fan, will referee the match. Frank Defford, who was a great admirer of the late roller derby star Joan Weston, wrote another story about her in the January 4 New York Times Magazine. UFC. The working plan for the March 13 pay-per-view show seems to include a couple of matches to debut a lighter weight, under 165 pounds, division with names like Ruben Asado, Pat Miletic and Matt Hume being considered along with some matches in the under 200 and heavyweight divisions. Jason Godsey of Pancrase is under consideration for a debut on the show, possibly against Maurice Smith. Many of the bigger name aren't going to be available for the show for various reasons including Randy Couture, Vitor Belfort, Kevin Jackson, and Mark Coleman. Boss Rutten was contacted about debuting but he still wants to take 5 months off fighting to heal his various injuries. With Couture out of the picture, the plan is to move Frank Shamrock into the main event position, which would be the first time UFC has headlined a show with its under 200-pound division. The tentative plan is for Shamrock to have a title unification match against EFC under 200-pound champion Igor Zinoviev, 4-0-1, but plagued a lot over the last year with a series of fairly serious injuries to his shoulder and wrist, although we're not sure if UFC will call it title unification or acknowledge Zinoviev's championship with the defunct EFC. Although they did with Maurice Smith before the Coleman match. UFC cut television commercials for the March 13 show on January 12 and the only match announced in the commercials as the main event is Shamrock vs. Zinoviev. There is the unfortunate lesson and contradiction when it comes to fighting sports, is that the lighter weight fighters generally give you the most action and the best matches and are generally the most skilled. However, it is the heavyweights who generally mean box office, and there are exceptions but those are generally due to media-created superhype for lighter weight fighters making them draws rather than them being draws based on technical ability or having good matches. Shamrock has the look and the skill to be marketable, but really no fighter in UFC has really been promoted into what you could call a real box office draw since the early days. There is some question as to whether or not the KRS show, originally on January 18 but moved to March 15, will even take place. The Hoist Gracie vs. Mark Kerr main event had only sold about 1,000 tickets to Yokohama Arena before Gracie pulled out of the match due to injury. One of the reasons news is slow here is because almost all the major events now are money losers, which inherently means they'll be coming less and less frequently. However, Marco Ruiz vs. Gary Goodridge is said to have been signed for March 15. ECW. The January 10th show at the ECW Arena was said by almost everyone to be the best show in several months and among the best shows ever, with a hot sellout crowd of an estimated 1,650, 400 to 500 turned away at the door. The show opened with Tommy Dreamer and Axl Rotten and Balls Mahoney beating the FBI. Tommy Rich did the same speech coming into the ring with 6-man tag title belts, claiming they won them from the Von Erichs and beat the Freebirds, Road Warriors and Paul Ellering, the Russians, etc. They did some spots with Jeff Jones as heel ref throwing powder at Rotten, but Beulah giving Jones a low blow. The Jones gimmick on television, the heel ref, and when the face refs like Jim Molyneux and John Finnegan come back on him, bit, which is one of the easiest heat-getting roles in wrestling, is the one gimmick that still comes off like amateur hour. Jerry Lynn beat Chris Condito with an armbar. Condito, who legitimately has a partial bicep tear, worked the match with his arm heavily taped, then took a bump and began selling like he had totally torn the arm, and Lynn used the arm breaker and Condito quickly tapped out. A lot of people thought the injury was legit, and in a sense the injury was, but the angle wasn't. Gran Hamada pinned Gran Naniwa in a matchup of wrestlers from Michinoku Pro. I've heard conflicting reports on this one, but most said it was the second worst match on the show. The ref counted 3 on the wrong near fall and the 2 ignored the 3 count and kept working until their own finish. Al Snow pinned Roadkill. This was the worst wrestling match on the show, but for television atmosphere, was the best. Paul Heyman gave away mannequin heads to most of the fans as a way to not only have great TV atmosphere but also to start pushing mannequin heads as the new hot gimmick merchandise, who were shaking them up and down as Snow came to the ring. His new finisher is a headbutt, using the mannequin head, coming off the top rope. Just Incredible beat Great Sasuke again using the spinning tombstone piledriver. Most of the match had Credible using submission holds on Sasuke's knee, but Sasuke would never submit. Sasuke will be undergoing reconstructive knee surgery this week legit, so the plan all along was to build Credible up as the guy who injured him for a feud both here and in Japan several months down the line. Credible also left Hamada laying with a tombstone, and Sasuke went out on a stretcher. Rob Van Dam beat Bam Bam Bigelow. After a ref bump, Condito came out with his arm in a sling. Bigelow went after Condito, but Sonny came out to stop him. Bigelow picked up Sonny, but then Francine showed up half undressed. Bigelow picked up Francine like he was going to give her a Michinoku driver, but then Shane Douglas ran out and gave Bigelow a low blow. In the ring, Van Dam came off the top rope with a side kick and got the pin with a frog splash. Taz kept the TV title, beating Too Cold Scorpio. Scorpio came out with Lance Wright, who is Vince McMahon's storyline stooge for the WWF. However, Scorpio turned on Wright during the ring announcement, saying that he wanted to be called Too Cold Scorpio and not Flash Funk, and giving Wright a moonsault. The two had a babyface match, which was said to have been Taz's best match in a long time, ending with Taz going over clean. After the match, Wright had Doug Furnace turn on Scorpio until Taz made the save. Brackus then did a run-in and Taz and Brackus had a pull-apart. After the match, Taz said that Scorpio would be welcome in his dressing room anytime. Bubba Ray and Devon and Big Dick Dudley beat Spike Dudley and New Jack and John Kronus when Kronus was pinned. Spike took a hip toss over the top rope into the crowd. They also teased a New Jack and Kronus split. Main event was billed as a Stairway to Hell match, which was barbed wire on the roof and a ladder underneath, and the object was to use the ladder to get the barbed wire between Sabu and Sandman. Match was said to have been a sick, brutal bloodbath, even sicker and bloodier than the Terry Funk Sabu barbed wire match. It was also said to have not been sloppy and was a great main event for this style. Sandman won after several shots with a cane. The highlight of the match came when Sandman was on the top of the ladder and Sabu knocked the ladder over, and Sandman took a bump from the top of the ladder over the top outside the ring and through a table. About 20 minutes after the show was over, there was a parking lot brawl involving several patrons of a second-story bar near the ECW arena and several of the wrestlers. Basically every story differs from the previous one. Apparently Chris Condito and Sonny had parked in a way that was blocking someone from the bar. When they got in their car to leave, Sonny and the woman who was blocked in exchanged words. A drink was thrown. Condito got involved to protect Sonny and people came out of the bar. Sabu was involved as well when someone ran back to the dressing room saying that Sabu was fighting a bunch of marks, which brought all the big guys out of the dressing room. Police were there in 3 minutes and it couldn't have been that serious because there were no arrests. None of the wrestlers were injured or marked up, although Condito took several stomps on the ground and there was a lot of pushing and shoving, and an estimated 30 people were involved in the fracas at its peak. One of the bar patrons apparently was roughed up a little, suffering a black eye from a punch by Scorpio. Virtually all the fans were gone at this point because the show ended so late. The other house show was January 9th in New Britain, Connecticut before a sellout 696 paid and $16,000. Brackus debuted in the ring beating Danny Morrison, and it was said he looked totally clueless. Sabu beat Sandman on top. There will be house shows on February 6th in Fort Lauderdale and February 7th in Kissimmee, Florida. They are negotiating to get the March 1st pay-per-view show moved to a 7 p.m. Eastern starting time from the current 9 p.m. pending approval of everyone involved. It is still not a definite that the show will be from Elizabeth, New Jersey, as there are logistical problems that need to be worked out. But it is still the prime site. The subsequent pay-per-view show will be on May 3rd. Scorpio worked the one shot and they gave the impression he'd be with ECW in its feud with WWF, but as far as things that had been worked out, it was a one-show deal, but they are now, because of how he got over, interested in using him whenever they can. Basically, the deal is that ECW can use any WWF talent that isn't booked at the time by the WWF as long as the talent doesn't have a problem doing the shot. Charles Skaggs wasn't booked over the weekend, so ECW asked if they could use him. Douglas' return looks to be moved back to mid or late February. The Bushwhackers inquired about coming in as the Sheepherders, but it doesn't look like it'll materialize. There has been talk about using Mexicans. Initially, Venom Black and Super Crazy were booked for January 10th, but Heyman canceled it. Shiryu, who wrestled for years for Michinoku Pro and now works for Promo Azteca, may come in for January 31st along with Crazy, although it's not a definite. WCW. Lineup for the January 24th sold-out pay-per-view: besides Flair vs. Hart, Nash vs. Giant, Tazwischko vs. Hall, and Luger vs. Savage, will be Booker T vs. Rick Martel for the TV title, Steiners and Ray Traylor vs. Conan and Marcus Bagwell and Scott Norton, Raven vs. Chris Benoit, and a Cruiserweight title match which I'm under the impression will wind up being Chris Jericho vs. Rey Mysterio Jr. The plan was to have the winners of two matches on Thunder, Mysterio Jr. vs. Juventud Guerrera and Eddie Guerrero vs. Jericho, meet on the pay-per-view. Nitro on January 12th in Jacksonville, Florida drew a sellout 8,718, 7,604, paying $133,186 for a pretty hot soap opera type show with what was said to have been the hottest crowd in the last 25 years for a house show in Jacksonville. The main theme was the NWO split. When the show started, Scott Hall, Randy Savage, and Elizabeth didn't show up with the rest of the NWO, and Kevin Nash made a comment about Savage not wanting any part of him. Later in the show, Hall, Savage, and Elizabeth arrived with Hiroyoshi Tenzan, and Savage acted like he wanted to find out what Nash said about him. The TV main was a tag title match with Steiners defending the belts against Kevin Nash and Scott Hall. Match was pretty good, except when Nash was in, as he was really out of shape, and this last knee injury seems to have really taken its toll on him, as he's pretty much immobile now. Both Savage and Hogan were at ringside. There was a ref bump when Nash accidentally kicked Hall, who knocked into Randy Anderson. Hogan then attacked Ted DiBiase. Nash gave Rick a low blow and was covering him. Savage went to the top rope to deliver the elbow onto Nash, but Nash saw it and moved, and Savage hit Rick, who was then pinned by Nash when Anderson recovered at 11:15 to win the titles. Savage acted like he was mad because he was after Nash. During the show, it was also announced that Savage and Nash would form a tag team on the January 15th Thunder show against Diamond Dallas Page and Lex Luger. Of course, you can't be a true wrestling fan if you try to use logic, so being an untrue fan, one has to question why J.J. Dillon reversed the decision on the January 8th Thunder when Luger interfered, costing Savage the match with Chris Adams, but did nothing when outside interference cost the Steiners the tag titles. There was no hint of Scott turning on Rick during the match, although the plan is for Scott to join the NWO. Ric Flair and Jim Neidhart had a confrontation where Neidhart said that Bret Hart was the best wrestler, and Flair acted like Neidhart was under the thumb of a woman who was Bret's sister, making him say things like that. They ended up in the ring, and Flair KO'd Neidhart with Nux and put on the Bret Hart figure 4 around the post until Hart made the save. Funny that even though Flair played total heel, particularly once they got in the ring, and then ran away from Hart, who worked as the face, that the fans take Flair as the home team guy and face in the feud. After losing to Steve McMichael, Chris Jericho went nuts again and attacked Rey Mysterio Jr., injuring his back, making him easy prey for Juventud Guerrera, who during his ring entrance jumped on the ropes, lost his balance, and embarrassingly fell on his ass in a cruiser title match in 45 seconds. Actually, Mysterio Jr. had an injured knee and really couldn't work. They did a storyline to show that Nash would show up to wrestle Giant after the 3 previous PPVs when the match was cancelled, saying NWO had to put up a $1.5 million appearance bond. Why they use numbers so ridiculous that everyone knows their work is beyond me. But I guess it's the same as why Tony Schiavone continually after the show was over called the Georgia Dome crowd 33,000. Why lie when the truth is impressive enough? Hogan's attorney Henry Holmes, his real-life attorney, then insisted WCW put up a bond of $1.5 million that Giant won't attack Nash before the pay-per-view, which they agreed to. So now Nash will continually harass Giant until the show. Booker T retained the TV title, beating Perry Saturn. Saturn won the match first with his feet on the ropes, but Rick Martel came out and told the ref, who restarted, and Booker won. After the match, Booker told Martel he owed him a favor, and Martel said the favor would be a title shot, which T agreed to. Chris Benoit beat Dean Malenko in 6:52 with the crossface in an excellent match. After the clean win, Raven DDT'd Benoit and the Flock then attacked Malenko, and Saturn put Malenko in the rings of Saturn. Marty Jannetty debuted beating Black Cat from New Japan with a rocker dropper, now called the showstopper, in a solid match. Jannetty was in good shape. Opener was a great UWF-style match as Bill Goldberg beat Jerry Flynn in 1:24. Apparently the day before at the worldwide tapings, these two did what was supposed to be an easy squash, and the bout was so hot they decided to put it on Nitro, and what aired was basically a duplicate of that match. Flynn has worked with PWFG in Japan and actually did the World Combat Championship shoot show, losing his only match, so he knows how to work UWF style, and since Goldberg is so over, they can do UWF style and get big pops doing it. The other shows this week were the TV taping on January 6th in Rome, Georgia, which drew $2,179 and $25,083, and Thunder in Daytona Beach on January 8th, which drew $4,121 and $85,882. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution ran 2 major articles over the past week on wrestling. The first was about the big crowd at the Georgia Dome for Nitro, and the second in the TV section on January 8th was about the debut of Thunder. Among the highlights of the March schedule is Nitro on March 2nd at the Core State Spectrum in Philadelphia, Saturday night taping on March 3rd in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, Thunder on March 5th in Columbus, Ohio, house show on March 6th in Pittsburgh at Palumbo Center, Nitro on March 9th in Winston-Salem, Thunder on March 12th in Baton Rouge, uncensored pay-per-view on March 15th in Mobile, Nitro on March 16th at Club La Vela in Panama City during spring break, Saturday night tapings on March 17th, in Dothan, Alabama, Thunder on March 19th in Terre Haute, house show on March 22nd in Cincinnati at the Crown, Nitro on March 23rd in Louisville, house show on March 25th in Baltimore, Thunder on March 26th in Fairfax, Virginia, house show on March 28th at the Palace in Auburn Hills, house show on March 29th in Milwaukee, Nitro on March 30th at the United Center in Chicago, and Saturday night tapings on March 31st in Madison, Wisconsin. There will also be a Nitro on either April 27th or June 15th at the Nassau Coliseum, which will be WCW's first venture into New York City in more than 1 year. The feeling seems to be that TNT losing the Sunday night NFL contract to ESPN is only going to be A+ for WCW. It'll make WCW an even higher priority to the TNT network because it'll move 1 slot up on the pecking order as the most important ratings getter the station has. TNT was the highest-rated primetime network the past 2 years, and in its own publicity this year, it was credited more to football, which outrates wrestling but only runs 8 shows per year as opposed to 52 wrestling shows, and basketball, which gets lower ratings than wrestling except during the playoffs or for a rare marquee game, and movies. It may also free up some of the huge rights fees TNT had to pay the NFL. The February 5th Thunder show scheduled for the Astrodome in Houston was moved to Beaumont, Texas. The reason is because the Astrodome wasn't set up well for a Nitro taping, and also because they are going to run a pay-per-view in the city before the end of the year at the Summit. Trying to run an Astrodome-sized show on a Thursday since Thunder doesn't have the drawing power yet of Nitro would be a risk. There has been a little talk regarding Kevin Green. Green's contract with the 49ers bans him from doing any pro wrestling. After the 49ers lost the NFC Championship game on Sunday, Green was asked about his future and said publicly that he'd like to return but was realistic enough to know at his salary and his age that they may not want him back. He has told friends that he thought this was his last season, and in fact he had thoughts about retirement before the season even started and he made the 49ers deal, and that he may be back in wrestling before long. Deborah McMichael has been dumped as they nixed the idea of her managing Ric Flair as a heel. Over the past few months WCW has dumped Sherry, Nancy Sullivan, Jacqueline, and now Deborah McMichael, plus Kimberly's involvement is strictly to lead Paige's ring entrance, and she's basically just a Nitro girl. So the only woman with a role left is Elizabeth. Have you noticed that ever since Mysterio Jr. and Guerrero wowed everyone with that tag match on Nitro, how many tag matches they've had on TV since? Speaking of TV, on Worldwide taped months ago but airing this week, they had Hennig beat Booker T clean, and the announcers had to explain it was a non-title match since no belts were around, and also ignored Jacqueline running around at ringside. With all the title changes coming so rapidly and with no long-term planning, lots of the house show advertising is screwed up, listing title matches that either won't, because neither of the participants have the title, or shouldn't be. The Hogan-Sting title matches announced in Boston and Las Vegas, which should be made non-title in the advertising, or else when they're made non-title at the arenas after being advertised as title matches, it'll be a ripoff. Although with business the way it is right now, promotions pretty much feel they have free rein to do just about anything since it's a hot product and fans are lining up to get in. Johnny Grunge suffered an apparent broken rib at the Disney taping when they used a non-gimmick table that didn't break for a table spot. The new company one-night merchandise record set at the Georgia Dome was about $176,000. Multichannel News did an article on Starrcade breaking the all-time WCW pay-per-view record and being the most successful pay-per-view wrestling show in 6 years for either group. The story had Turner sources estimating 600,000 to 625,000 buys, but they also claimed 500,000 for Havoc, which is about a 33% exaggeration of the realistic 350,000 figure. The story itself, and Multichannel News is considered a reliable industry source when it comes to buy rates, claimed a 1.9 buy rate and said it was almost double the previous best over the past few years by WCW. Request TV claimed a national 1.8 buy rate for the show. A 1.9 would translate to 530,000 to 580,000 buys and a $6.52 million gross, making it the third biggest pay-per-view event of the year, trailing only Tyson Holyfield and De La Hoya Whitaker, ending up slightly ahead of Holyfield more, which was considered in the industry as a disappointment. It would also make it the biggest money pro wrestling anywhere of the year, as throwing in the live gate and merchandise the figures would top $7 million, which is more than New Japan would have taken in at the January 4th Tokyo Dome show. Weekend TV ratings for January 3rd and January 4 saw main event at 1.1, Saturday night at 2.6 and pro at 1.5. Main event and pro were dropped after that week with Thunder debuting on TBS, so for January 10th only Saturday night, which did a 2.4, still exists. WWF Raw as Nitro on January 12th in State College, Pennsylvania drew a sellout 8,628 and $124,765. It was a really good show with a super hot crowd as well. The show opened with DX in a limo with Michaels climbing up out of the sunroof and pulling his pants down. They also got a rip on the Bret Hart / Ric Flair in there when Triple H asked Michaels to do that, saying, and Michaels started with the best there is, the best there was, and Triple H interrupted him saying not the lame old stuff. They had a four corners match with Godwins, Headbangers, Truth Commission, and New Age Outlaws. It was better than you'd think, although the first pinfall rules are lame, and then the match makes no logical sense, as why would someone ever tag anyone other than their teammate when the first pinfall wins? Anyway, Billy Gunn pinned Phineas after hitting him with a foreign object in 411. After the match, Austin gave both Godwins stunners. Kurgan beat Lance Diamond and Jimmy Cicero in 222. The rules were he had to beat both, but when he beat the first guy, they rang the bell and played the music early, so it was a screw up and he kept fighting and then beat both guys. That training camp did him at least some good. 2 weeks ago he was wrestling like Giant Baba when Baba was 60, and now he wrestles like Baba did when he was 55. Owen Hart then attacked Triple H in the limo and Shawn and Chyna jumped in and pounded on him as the limo drove off. This was about as good as the referees fighting in ECW. Apparently the limo fight was somewhat lame, partially because Hart had to be so protective of Helmsley because of the knee, combined with being in such a confined surroundings while trying to do what should look like a fight. Mark Merrow came out with Goldust dressed as Sable for a match with Vader. Sable eventually came out yelling at Goldust for stealing her gimmick and kicked Goldust. It wound up with Goldust hitting Vader with a coconut that he stuffed his bra with for the DQ in 256. The limo came back with no Owen Hart, and they went backstage where Vader was writhing in pain as supposedly Austin gave him a stunner. D'Lo Brown and Rocky Maivia wrestled Mark Henry and Ken Shamrock, ending when Shamrock had the ankle lock on Maivia, and Henry turned on Shamrock, and the Nation of Domination sans Farouk all destroyed Shamrock. Henry took off his Rocky Sucks shirt and had underneath a Nation of Domination shirt. Rocky gave Shamrock the urinage and Henry counted 3. Farouk was acting like he didn't know about the plot and acted mad about it. Michaels cut a promo on Tyson, totally making Tyson into a face. Hart showed up on the screen with a scratched up face and they challenged him to come out, which he did, but officials broke everything up. Jim Cornette then introduced the Rock and Roll Express as the NWA Tag Team Champions, but also called them 5-time champions, although they also had no belts. If they are the champs, they should have belts and it would make them 6-time champions, but then again, the NWA title really only dates back to 1948, not 1905, and the match everyone talks about as the first world title match in 1905 really was in 1908 anyway. Crowd was dead. Morton, who is 41, Gibson, 40, looked positively ancient, and it was actually like watching a Saturday Night Live spoof of two old men trying to be the Rock and Roll Express. And after seeing Dustin Runnels in lingerie, you'd think everything would look good in comparison. Crowd was dead. Cornette interfered for the DQ in 2:28. 8-ball decked Cornette, but Morton hit him with the racket. Finally Chains made the save. Cactus Jack, who seems to be using the name more and more at the house shows since Cactus Jack is the most over character of the three, did an interview showing clips of some matches from Japan and ECW against Terry Funk, and said Chainsaw Charlie was Terry Funk. Mankind and Goldust, who was dressed as Dude Love, went out there for 30 seconds before Austin came out and stunned both of them. McMahon was on the screen, booed heavily, and said Tyson would be both at the Rumble and on Raw in Fresno. Savio Vega and Jesus Castillo beat Taka Michinoku and Scott Taylor when Castillo pinned Taylor after a reverse DDT off the middle ropes in 4:34. It wasn't good, and Vega didn't even sell Michinoku's moonsault off the middle rope to the floor. DX then did an interview announcing Kane as their new member, but Undertaker came out. As Taker was distracted by Triple H, Michaels superkicked him and they doubled on Taker until Kane made the save. They played up big time that Kane had turned face and joined up with Taker. It was a good angle if it results in Kane costing Taker the title at Rumble, which I presume is what it was all about. If they decide to turn Kane face this early because he's getting cheered so much, then I'd say it wasn't a good angle. Obviously the long term has to be Kane as a face, but they need to at least get the mileage out of the heel deal first. Show ended with the Rumble drawings, but instead everyone wound up fighting everyone like a battle royal with the show going off the air, and they made a big deal about Honky Tonk Man being the final entrant and Nation of Domination beating up Austin. After the show ended, Undertaker beat Maivia in less than 5 minutes in the casket match. Before the show started, Bart Gunn was given a tryout in his new gimmick as Black Bart, still as a babyface but dressed all in black. Farouk got a total babyface reaction when he came out for a match on Shotgun, and Owen Hart beat Brian Christopher on Shotgun in what was said to have been a good match. House show business remained great over the weekend. January 9th in Scranton drew a sellout 4,087 and an all-time record gate of $75,640. January 10th in Madison Square Garden drew a sellout 19,259, 15,712 paid, and a non-pay-per-view record gate of $371,003 and another $143,406 in merchandise. In January 11th in Pittsburgh drew 7,279 and $141,907. Total merchandise for the weekend was $304,618 or $8.53 per head. With the Helmsley injury, the entire shows were changed. Most reports are the MSG show was subpar, with all short matches, nothing even going 10 minutes and ending in 2 hours and 20 minutes, making it the shortest MSG show in years. Michinoku beat Brian Christopher in a good short match. Godwins beat Headbangers in a 3 minutes whipping match. Brandy beat Mero via DQ for the low blow. Then they did the MTV promo with Steve Austin for the Super Bowl halftime show on MTV. The promo will be airing for the next 2 weeks about 12 times per day on MTV, so it's a lot of mainstream exposure. Shamrock beat Farouk. Farouk and Kama teased a breakup and actually were fighting each other after the match and both decked Brown until Maivia broke it up. As they were setting up the cage, Jim Cornette did a 5-minute promo on NWA history. In a cage match with no rules that climbing over the top or through the door no longer ends the match, only pin or submission, Undertaker and LOD beat New Age Outlaws and Michaels when Undertaker pinned Michaels after a tombstone due to interference from Owen Hart. Ever since Little Rock, Michaels has been put on during the middle of the show instead of last. Vader pinned Goldust in a match Vader made watchable. Kane pinned Chains in less than 2 minutes. Finale saw Cactus Jack and Austin beat Maivia and Brown when Austin pinned Maivia with a stunner. Austin was able to work a good fast style with Maivia, and apparently he's able to do a lot more both in the ring and as far as training with heavier weights to get his physique back up. They announced for February 22nd at the Continental Airlines Arena Austin and Dude Love vs. Maivia and Farouk, Michaels and Helmsley vs. Hart and Shamrock and Outlaws vs. LOD for the belts. It appears the idea for house show matches is to work shorter matches because Pittsburgh was basically the same card with all short matches and the same results except that Michaels and Outlaws won a regular match over Undertaker and LOD. Helmsley will be out of the ring, although he's working as a second just about every night, until early February with his dislocated kneecap. Since he was in the main event on every house show for the rest of the month, the idea right now is for the cities that Shawn Michaels is booked to wrestle in, they'll do the same six-man with LOD and Taker vs. Michaels and Outlaws as the new main event. Michaels, who injured his foot over the weekend, which explains his limping on Raw, wouldn't work any additional dates with Helmsley missing shows he was supposed to main as a single. I believe the main events in the cities originally scheduled for Owen vs. Triple H will be Owen and Shamrock vs. Maivia and Brown, including Las Vegas on January 17th. Undertaker, Austin and Michaels were all given Las Vegas off to rest up for the Rumble since they're the ones who have to carry the show and all have injuries. Advance for the Royal Rumble in San Jose is $15,522 and $385,477 as of January 12th, which with comps is basically already a sellout. TV tapings in Fresno and Davis are both close to being sold out as well. The NWA name is becoming a weird topic now. Jonathan Holliday, a former wrestler in Oregon and Calgary who has been promoting a few shows in California, sent legal letters to, among other people, the NWA headed by Dennis Coralluzzo and Howard Brody, the WWF for using the NWA name, and even Pro Wrestling Illustrated. He claims legal rights to the name, but the trademarked NWA name from the 50s is controlled by Coralluzzo and Brody. Holliday is claiming to have the support of Lou Thez, Don Owen, and Bob Geigel, and it is true that Thez is supporting Holliday, but other than being its first champion, and one of the most influential players in the early history of the NWA, we're not sure exactly what that legally means. Anyway, that's the point. WWF seems to be ignoring it all and going on with its angle. WWF has reached an agreement where the William Morris Agency will be handling entertainment booking of its talent. Terry Funk will be in the Royal Rumble. Dan Severn has officially signed his WWF contract as expected. No word on whether or not he'll be involved in the NWA angle or announced as NWA World Champion, although on the WWF hotline, Jim Ross always refers to him as NWA Champion. If he's in the NWA angle, the upside is that Jim Cornette through his talking probably has the best shot at getting him over, but the counter to this is it'll make him a heel, which is now what he'd be naturally very good at being. Jacques Rougeau and Carl-Pierre Ouellet were also signed this past week and will likely reform their Quebecers tag team, perhaps as early as the January 19th TV tapings. Ouellet had been wrestling in Europe for Otto Wands, where he worked something like 90 straight nights, which has gotten his weight down to a manageable 265 pounds for whatever it peaked out at during his WCW days. Ouellet was an improving underrated wrestler in WWF, but due to his weight and perhaps a lack of motivation, Jacques and Pierre were both pretty bad in WCW. Jacques was phoning it in his entire WCW stay. In some ways, considering how everything went down, it's amazing Jacques is back here. But this being wrestling, nothing is a surprise. Jeff Jarrett missed the weekend due to his wife being diagnosed with cancer, which was one of several family tragedies he had to attend to. Headhunters were offered a contract at a very low figure, as in less than $85,000, and turned it down. Both Severn and Shamrock appeared on the CBS show Nash Bridges on January 9th. Virtually everything we've heard about the WWF training dojo headed by Dory Funk and Pat Patterson was positive. From various accounts, the standouts in the camp were Sean Morley, who hasn't signed but is expected to do so shortly, Adam Copeland and Takamichi Inoku, and that Ahmed Johnson showed up at 280 pounds, down about 35 pounds from when he left, and worked his way out of the doghouse with his attitude and willingness to learn. While a date hasn't been set, the plan is to regularly do camps like this. Highlights of the March and April schedule are March 1st in St. Paul, March 2nd Raw in Cleveland, March 3rd Raw in Wheeling, West Virginia, March 6th Montreal, March 8th Buffalo, March 13th Anaheim, March 15th San Diego, March 16th Phoenix, March 22nd Madison Square Garden, March 29th WrestleMania in Boston, March 30th Raw in Albany, March 31st Raw in Utica, then a 2-week Europe tour, including the April 4th England pay-per-view from Manchester, followed by a return to the U.S. for Raw on April 13th from Philadelphia, and April 14th in Binghamton, April 15th at Nassau Coliseum, April 25th in Greensboro, April 26th pay-per-view from Chicago Rosemont Horizon, April 27th Raw from Rockford, Illinois, and April 28th Raw from Green Bay. King of the Ring will be June 28th in Pittsburgh and SummerSlam will be August 30th from Madison Square Garden. As we mentioned before, the WWF was planning on a theme of using sleazy celebrities at Mania for their bad image. The only one we know that has accepted thus far is Pete Rose, who will probably be a timekeeper for one of the main events. Most any celeb with a seedy rep short of OJ will likely have been contacted. For weekend ratings, for the January 3rd to January 4th weekend, Livewire did a 1.6 and Superstars a 1.7, and for January 10th to 11 Livewire did a 1.5 and Superstars a 1.7. Gorilla Monsoon made his first appearance at a taping since his near-fatal heart problems. He's said to have lost 50 to 60 pounds through modifying his diet, and at least at this point there are no plans for him to have a heart transplant, although he may at some point require heart surgery. Despite rumors to the contrary, there are no plans at all at bringing Yokozuna back. It would be almost impossible to use him because he can't get a license due to his weight and his irregular heartbeat. Toronto and Vancouver have strong advances for Michaels vs. Owen matches in late February. Wrestling Observer Newsletter. P.O. Box 1228, Campbell, California 95009-1228. January 19, 1998.